2, 3. Welcome to the Gnostic Warrior, Dr. Sedgwick. How are you doing today?
To be with you.
Great. And what I like to do before we get into your great work is if you can give us a little biography about your history to let the audience and I know about who you are.
I was born in the United Kingdom. I trained as a historian. I moved to Egypt, where I got interested in Sufism whilst I was working at the American University in Cairo. And I spent 20 years in the end. I didn't intend that at all when I moved there, but I spent 20 years in the end in Cairo working with Sufism and then with various other things like traditionalism, esotericism, and so forth. And then finally I moved to Denmark, which is where I am now, and I work at Aarhus University, where I'm a professor in the Department for the Study of Religion.
I'm definitely interested in Sufism. I feel there's a line of Gnostic thought there in Islam as well, and I've interviewed various Sufi masters and then members of Sufi orders, Masonic orders as well. Would you agree that they are along the line of the Gnostic path back to traditionalism?
Of course, one can have a big discussion about what the Gnostic path is. And as an academic, I'm always very careful to try and, define these things, these terms before using them. But yeah, basically, I would agree with that. The Sufism is a lot of things. And one of the things it is a theology, which is what people tend to look at in the West, because they tend to access Sufism through its writings. And there are some great writings, whether you want Rumi or whether you want Ibn Arabi, really great writings there. And these writings are definitely in the, well, I tend to think a lot about the Neoplatonic line, and they're very definitely in the Neoplatonic line, and therefore perhaps also in the Gnostic line. But if you go from the West to a country like Egypt, you find that Sufism isn't just this sort of intellectual, spiritual path, that Sufism is also a really important part of popular culture. And you discover that there are Sufis who are illiterate. And then you realize, or at least I realized, that most Sufis had been illiterate throughout the history of Islam. So that gives you a slightly different take on it, that you try and think of it as a non-literate tradition, which it is.
I never knew that, actually. That's interesting knowledge that you're sharing with me. It seems like they focus on the state of being rather than just on knowledge gnosis, correct?
Absolutely, absolutely. Although, of course, in Sufism, the point that you are trying to reach, which is described in various different ways, and sometimes it's described as union, as it is elsewhere in the Neoplatonic tradition, but it's also sometimes described as knowledge. And of course, in Arabic, there are two different words for knowledge, both which you have to translate into English as knowledge. And one of them, ilm, tends to be used for the sort of knowledge that you can get by coming to my classes or reading books. And ma'rifa, the other sort of knowledge, is the knowledge of the direct experience of the necessary being or of the one or whatever. Yes, do you reach knowledge type 2 just by reading books? No way. Can you read books as well to try and get you to knowledge number 2? Yes.
Yeah, that's interesting. Then have the concept of Christianity where they have, of course, the faith and believing and it will happen. And then you have, of course, experiential knowledge, meaning you do the work to make those beliefs or that faith you have happen. I believe that knowledge, like you had said, can help you get to stage 2, which I believe happened to me, especially if you start off backwards, right? In your
Absolutely. And of course, one of the things, what I was just calling, what you were calling stage 2 and what I was calling knowledge type 2, one of the other terms that one can use is gnosis.
Sure. Yeah, if we were to go back to the Greeks, that would be their concept. So let's talk about, I consider you one of the world's experts on traditionalism. What are the various interpretations of traditionalism, and what does it mean to you as you understand it after 20 years of writing about it?
Yeah. Okay. there's what I try and distinguish between is small t traditionalism and big T traditionalism, because there is a sort of generic traditionalism in the sense of respecting tradition or looking back to tradition or not liking change even. And in that sense, in the small t sense, my father, God rest his soul, was something of a traditionalist because he was not very keen on what happened after the 1960s. But then there's also the big T traditionalism, which is the one that I work on and have, as you say, been working on for 20 years now. And the big T traditionalism is a particular set of doctrines and understandings that are associated, initially at least, with the work of the French philosopher René Guénon. And you could also call traditionalism, big T traditionalism, you could also call it Guénonianism, because the work of Guénon is so important to it. Or you could also call it perennialism, and sometimes these guys refer to themselves as perennialists. Now, that one, of course, then gets us into the question of this perennialism. And at this point, I think I'd probably have to have a little p perennialism and a big P perennialism as well.
Gotcha. And we'll get into that as well. So I see the little t as the basic understanding of traditionalism and values and morals that we all seem to have that come through us through religion and our culture. And then the big T is actually a set of ideas that are transmuted through time that various traditionalists and philosophers have honored. And they've compounded on these concepts and added to them as time went on. Explain the difference between the traditionalist and the modern times and modernity. You have people that think the traditionalists just want us to go back to the Middle Ages and we're all knights on horses. And then there's the other that we basically, the traditionalist idea is that we take the good, of course, from the society and modernity, and then we throw out all the bad ideas that are causing our culture to go down to hell, or to have all these bad neoliberal ideas that aren't based upon traditional concepts and tested ideas.
Yeah. Of course, there are some traditionalists who would like us to go back to the Middle Ages. Mm-hmm. And there was a Russian who was a small t traditionalist, so not really in the movement of Guénon, but there was a Russian who wrote a very popular book in the 1920s called The New Middle Ages, which is, he was a Russian Christian who had experienced the revolution and had wound up in France and had some strong views about the revolution, obviously, and what the revolution represented. And he, as I say, was calling for a return to the Middle Ages, not in the sense of wandering around the place in the mud and using horses to pull plows, but because he thought that the spiritual values and a lot of the social organization and things like that in the Middle Ages were actually much better than those of his own age. And this is very much the line taken by the big T traditionalists who I've been working with, Guénon, for example, to challenge the general idea of progress, to challenge the general idea that modernity is an improvement on earlier periods. And this is quite interesting because when you look at it, you find that although I think most people would agree with me that the general idea of modernity is that it's a great thing and it represents progress and rationality and science and material comfort and all sorts of things like that. When you actually begin to look at it, people have been questioning this, and people have been criticizing modernity and questioning this from a variety of perspectives for an awful long time. And even some of the Western philosophers and scholars who we associate with this positive view of modernity, from Hegel to Weber, there's also a criticism of modernity there. But anyhow, The traditionalists, Guénon and Camp, put tradition and modernity in opposition to each other. And they could make a very fundamental critique of modernity by saying that the key to understanding modernity is to recognize that it is the negation of tradition. So for Guénon, there was this primordial tradition that went back through the centuries and the millennia, and essentially taught one thing. And that one thing had once been known to everybody and was completely obvious to everybody, and was the foundation of civilization, social life, and so forth. And with modernity, it had all been forgotten. And worse than that, modernity was very often the negation of that tradition.
This tradition, when I look back to, how our modern culture and societies were formed, we can go back really to ancient Greece, where they define the politics and the philosophies that come back to us today through Homer, to Plato, to Aristotle. And then, of course, we get the various Christian religions who also have a big part in building the West. So when I look at all the different universities, and here I am in California, I live right off Mission Road, and Mission Road's near El Camino, and all these roads were traveled by the Christians, the Jesuits, who were basically starting all the different colleges and the schools. And I'm like looking around, and then there was a lot of tribes around here, Native American tribes as well. And I used to be on the side of the Native Americans, hey, the Christians, after I went back against my tradition, saying this was all bad. When I look at what happened over the centuries in time, Christianity played such a huge role in our culture and our society. During the 60s, what your dad didn't like, it seems like that type of lifestyle and the morals, the kind of Christian upbringing, mom and dad raising the kids, getting a house and stuff, got thrown out the window. And it was the me generation, which all about me. And that's where I grew up. That's the mentality that I was taught. I feel that materiality, this selfishness, my own experience down this path is the road to destruction, because it almost destroyed me as well. So what I see with modernity, it's all about me and the now, not thinking about the past and not predicting the future. It's all about how much money I can make, the fame, or whatever it may be. And then you have our culture, which is the people composing it, all copying this. I'm a businessman, and if I don't step in line, I don't make money. So I get that there's this separation between modernity, and then also traditionalism seems more based on philosophies, on truth, on tradition, on honoring something, rather than it just being about me. It's about the whole community. It's about the past. It's about my ancestors. It's about the great philosophers. It's about honoring that going forward, where the modernity, it's all about me and screw you and everybody else. So when I look at those two mentalities, one leads us to hell or war, and we're fighting everybody over these egos and these different ideas. And the other, the tradition, is what lines us or connects us together, the community, whether it be Egypt, whether it be Denmark, whether it be Russia, whether it be Britain. There's this traditionalism that connects us all, but where we're divided is by the self and the ego and modernity. What are your thoughts on that?
The traditionalists would very much agree with you on that. And I think one of the things that is quite important, of the me generation issue, and how do we relate to the me? This is an issue that Guénon and actually the Sufis and people like that have been writing about and thinking about for a very long time. And Guénon here tended to follow the Sufi line. And the Sufi line, like a number of other approaches, breaks up the me into different bits. And the essential division is between the eternal me and the earthly me. There's the earthly or animal, which is similar to to a cat or a dog, or has the same sort of imperatives of logic, of wanting food, of wanting other things that we have as human beings and that we have in common with animals. So this earthly me or lower me or animal me or something like that, which in Arabic is called the nafs, which is a term which is sometimes translated as ego, which gets a bit confusing because the animal me is very, very egotistical. We also have the use of ego by Freud, and for Freud, ego is something quite different. So, bit confusing there. Anyhow, we've got the animal me, the nefs, and we have the eternal me, the me which is linked to the transcendent, the me which is, according to some interpretations, immortal, the me that came from outside this manifestation, from outside this world, is temporarily in me now and will survive. And the question for the Sufis and for many other people, so what do we do about this? Do we just, the eternal me, the spirit, do we let it be captured by the animal me and dragged down to earth? Or do we try to separate it from the animal me so that it can turn towards its origin and perhaps then return to its origin, to its transcendent origin? And obviously for the Sufis, the answer to this is, of course, we want to liberate the spiritual me from the material world. And how do we do that? By disciplining the animal me, by refusing the animal me the things that it wants sometimes, by fasting a bit sometimes. And therefore, a certain sort of 1960s approach to gratifying the me is the diametric opposite of what Sufis and people like that have been doing for 1,000 years and other people before them. So from that perspective, the traditionalists take an extremely negative view of what happened in the 60s. But there was something positive there as well. Because if you look at these guys who I've been reading for years, when do people suddenly get interested in their books? When do people start really exploring all this stuff? It's in the 60s and the 70s. There were some Westerners who were interested in these great traditions of Neoplatonism and Sufism and Gnosticism during the 19th century. There were few and far between. And the people who were reading Thoreau, Emerson, these great names from the American 19th century, yeah, I mean, people were reading them, but I don't know quite how they understood them. But then, in the 60s and 70s, and it does actually fit with the decline of Christian faith and Christianity, that people get interested in other things. The 60s were not all bad for everybody from this perspective.
I agree that it did open the floodgates to the world that we see now, neoliberalism, and I believe, of course, the satanic culture that we have, which some people could argue. But it also, there's the saying, you can't see the light unless you've been in the darkness, and they can't live without the other. So I would be one of those people that grew up under this culture, then eventually went back to the light and traditionalism, what I'd say the path. So I believe all the pain and everything and the darkness that I've been through helped me to see the light and to see the truth and to see through experiential knowledge. I didn't just talk about it and write about it based on what I heard. I actually lived through all this, and I'm living through it now with my family and my wife, where before I lived more liberally in how I lived and treated people. And now I do it more based on traditionalism and Christian values, and my life is much better. I might not have as much money and be as, popular or whatever in my town, but I'm much happier going down this route. You talk about the Sufis were fast a little here and there and don't drink or whatever it may be. So I like to have a beer here and there. And sometimes I'll go months where every weekend I'm having beers, and then I'm like, geez, I'm not controlling myself. I need to stop for 6 or 7 months or whatever. Right now, I'm on a clean, sober streak where I'm not drinking on the weekend. It's just something that I've done since I was younger, this ritual that I learned from my parents. But in any event, when I researched drinking, that goes back many hundreds, if not thousands of years, when the Gnostics had a saying, nothing in excess. So I think that goes in line with the Sufis, and it's all about controlling that lower self. And in Christianity, they called it by the Greek word sarkos or sarkos, the works of the sarkos. It was called the mind of the flesh. They believed that the mind of the flesh was a separate, it caused sin, it was materiality, and there was a type of hive mind that controlled it, i.e. the devil, or what the Hebrews would have called Leviathan or Behemoth. And people that followed the flesh or the hive mind were likely to sin and cause murders, and those were the people you not want to follow. And that was in contrast to the Holy Spirit, which came from God above, that we all could participate in if we rise above our flesh or our earthly desire. I want to talk a little bit about someone that I had recently on my podcast, the Russian author and philosopher, Professor Alexander Dugan, who I believe is one of the most famous traditionalists right now talking about it, and also one of the most, I'd say, attacked philosophers. He's been dubbed the most dangerous man in the world. His books have been banned off of Amazon and so forth. Can you tell us a little bit about Alexander Dugan and your studies into him?
Alexander Dugan is, as you say, I think probably the most interesting and the most prominent of the traditionalists today. And he is indeed controversial, and he's controversial because of his political positions, but also because I think he was always a bit controversial. If you go back to his earliest days, he was a dissident in the Soviet Union, and he was part of a group which was influenced somewhat by the Gurdjieff tradition. And the Gurdjieff tradition involves living in certain ways, in a sense, doing outrageous things sometimes because of the impact that it has on you and helping you to understand what your true self is and so forth. At the very beginning of his career, he was doing outrageous things, and with some pretty outrageous people, some amazing poets and novelists who were very much in opposition to the Soviet system. And he's carried on doing outrageous things since, I think. He's also written a lot and thought a lot. And he has produced what I sometimes think of as a certain sort of post-traditionalism, because the original traditionalism starts off actually before the First World War with some ideas that were around then, and is really developed in the 20s and 30s between the two world wars. And the ideas, the issues that traditionalism is dealing with are very fundamental issues about modernity and life and so forth, which explains why people today are still reading and finding interesting answers in people who were writing in the 1920s and 1930s, which doesn't happen that often, in fact. But in some ways, I think traditionalism had sort of got to the end of the way that it was exploring things by perhaps the late 80s, early 90s. And then, as it happens, along comes Alexander Dugin, who discovers the works of the traditionalists, but discovers them in a slightly strange order, because the starting point logically is the works of René Guénon, who I've referred to before, who's the father of the whole school of thought. And then a second figure who comes along is an Italian called Julius Evola. And Evola is the guy who gave a sort of political application to the whole traditionalist thought. Evola was interested in the spiritual things. He was interested in self-realization. He was interested in paths to gnosis and so forth. But he lived in Italy during the Mussolini period, and he was politically active in the Mussolini period. He, in fact, thought that Mussolini wasn't really right-wing. He was also politically active in the Third Reich during the Nazi period, and he thought the Nazis had got their racial ideology all mixed up. So Evola was a sort of internal critic of fascism and Nazism, not from a leftist position, but from a rightist position, which is really quite unusual. Now, Evola, was he a nice guy? Can we defend some of the things he did? I don't know. In fact, I think I do know. We probably can't. But anyhow, the traditionalist who Dugan first encountered was not Guénon, but Evola. And this had something to do with the rather odd system that the Soviets had of deciding which books were on the open shelves and which books were on the closed shelves. And clearly, whoever was responsible for making that decision hadn't actually read half the books in question, because some of the fairly inoffensive ones ended up on the closed shelves, and some of Evola's most explosive texts somehow were sitting there on the open shelves. So Dugan takes traditionalism, he takes the more political version of it with Evola, he takes some other thinkers, he somehow gets in touch with some of the French New Right thinkers, and then he puts all this together with the extraordinary changes in the Soviet Union that are happening when he is a young man. So the Soviet system, which he's spent most of his youth rebelling against, collapses and is replaced by a sort of version of the Western system, which in his view is even worse than the Western system that you find in the West. And in the end, as he tells people, possibly told you when you interviewed him, he comes to the conclusion that actually the Soviet system was preferable. And that launches him into a spiritually, religiously, traditionalist-based critique of the version of modernity that arrives in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that leads him into political activism, some of it really quite outrageous once again, but I think he was a leading member of something called the National Bolshevist Party, which in my view, actually, you shouldn't really understand it as a serious political organization. I think it was more of a countercultural performance art type stunt. And from there, he then moves on to a series of other positions. He brings recently, especially, he brings Heidegger into his thought and produces a new synthesis of this, which I find very interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting to watch Alexander Dugan, and I enjoyed speaking with him. I share a lot of similar views, but of course there's a lot of critics that condemn his views. And I think a lot of that is based upon the shenanigans and also him being close to Putin and the various military. He's not going to always show all his cards. And I know, again, that part of military and political strategy is actually to mislead people as well. So sometimes I think those criticisms come from the shenanigans that you mentioned and the misleading. And then, of course, sometimes I believe he clearly tells you what he wants to do and his plans. Do you believe that he has a part in influencing Russia and where they're going back towards orthodoxy and traditionalism? Because I see a big shift happening there. And then a lot of us here in the West were criticized because we agree with some of those and we like some of the things that are happening in Russia, and then we don't like what's happening here with everything and the neoliberal values. So what are your thoughts there?
I think that Russia has changed a lot since the early post-Soviet years. And one of the reasons it's changed is because of President Putin. Another reason it's changed is that the things that went wrong during the Yeltsin period went so badly wrong that people wanted to get away from that. The version of modern liberalism that turned up in early post-Soviet Russia was built around the mafia, it was built around corruption, it was built around chaos, it was built around theft, it was built around, as one Russian friend of mine said, about the reversal of society, whereby the people who'd been on top before, professors like my friend, found themselves at the bottom of society with barely enough money to buy food. And the people who'd been at the bottom of society, the pickpockets, the criminals, had found themselves at the top of society. And that, what I'm trying to say here is that there were many reasons that things in Russia have changed recently. And yes, they have changed very much towards Dugin's perspectives. And yes, people listen to Dugan with more interest than they did in the Yeltsin years, when he seemed some sort of marginal eccentric almost. But I don't think that we can say that these changes happened because of Dugan. Russia is a big country. There are many voices there. There are people who are have a lot more influence on President Putin than Dugan does. There are people who are more widely read. There are people who have bigger audiences on television, etc., etc. So I think it's Russia moved towards Dugan, I think, more than Dugan dragged Russia in his direction. Of course, one thing we have to say, when you're talking about how he's controversial and so forth, he is a critic of the idea of democracy. He is not a Democrat. He has never claimed to be a Democrat. He regards democracy as a bad thing. Now, that is a position which is certainly going to be controversial in many places.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think the concept of democracy understood differently by people, especially here in the West, because if we go back to the time of Greece, it was actually a republic, right? So a republic, I believe, is what you talk about, where the people on top are the professors and the philosophers, the great thinkers, the people who contribute to society with their minds and their lives is the republic, where the democracy is more of like we have now, where people, you had mentioned Soviet Russia, where everybody, the pickpocket rises to the top. What Dugan describes, or you describe there, I actually believe we have here in the United States right now as we speak, with the various criminals leading through, not of course everybody, but I believe that's how the United States of America is working. In my experience, working with blue collar jobs and various entrepreneurs, a lot of them were white collar criminals. And I knew that once I got up into the various echelons of management, you could see this, and it goes down to the lower levels, like I had said, through even to blue collar service businesses, which I've seen it. So let's talk about the future of what you believe might happen. And you wrote several, every year you're coming out with a book or two, but one of the books that will lead from Alexander Dugan would be to the thread of the new, what's the name of the book? Key Thinkers of the Radical Right Behind the New Threat to Liberal Democracy. And in that, you're the editor of that book. 16 expert scholars explain 16 thinkers of the right. The book claims that since the start of the 21st century, the political mainstream has been shifting to the right. The liberal orthodoxy that took hold of the West as a reaction to the Second World War is breaking down. In Europe, populist political parties have pulled the mainstream in their direction. In America, a series of challenges to the Republican mainstream culminated in the 2016 election of Donald Trump. So let's talk a little bit about that before we get more into your new work.
You've read out what I see to be happening, and this is partly a conclusion that I've come to trying to answer the question of, why are these traditionalist writers and thinkers, Evola especially, why are they getting more and more popular nowadays? And if we were saying earlier about the 60s, that this was a period in which people started reading alternative texts on Sufism and stuff like that. The popularity of Evola, and to some extent Dugan actually today, is phenomenal. he's everywhere. He's in every language. He's translated into, well, he hasn't quite been translated into Basque, but he's really available everywhere now. So I'm asking myself, why is this, right? And it's a bit like the question that you were asking about Dugan in Russia. Have the traditionalists pulled people in the West towards their perspective? Or are things shifting in the West in a direction which means that there are more people who are interested in this sort of writer, in this sort of alternative? And I think this is what's happening in the West as well. You can also see the changes in the structure of politics. Now, as I said at the beginning, I grew up in the United Kingdom. And when I was young, the politics was all about this struggle between left and conservatives, as they were called then. And on the left, we had the Labour Party, which was deeply based in the union, in the union movement. Some people involved in it were doctrinally very close to Marxism, but it was a political party based on organized labor. And the big political struggle was between organized labor and alternative visions. And on the conservative side, there wasn't actually much of a vision, really. It was about resisting or moderating what the socialists were trying to do. That's the world that I grew up in, and it's a world which has now vanished. And one of the reasons it's vanished is that organized labor has vanished from most of the developed Western economies. Where are all the steel workers? Where are the miners? Where are the ships? They're all in China now. There are a couple. We do still have a few people building cars in Germany next to where I am here in Denmark. They are very well paid. The processes are very automated. They have a reasonably good life, frankly. And they're now conservative more than socialists. So the economic basis of Western politics, certainly of European politics, a bit more complicated in the US, I think, but certainly of European politics, the economic basis of it has changed as the economies have changed, as technologies have changed. And if I want to establish a leftist socialist political party based on organized labor and the unions, I'm not going to win a seat in my local council election, let alone win a national election, because they just aren't there anymore. So what is the new argument about? I think this is very clear in Europe, that the new argument is between the liberals, the people who are resisting the liberals, who see the liberals as globalists, as the children of the 60s. And the key issue is very much immigration. And this is a reconfiguration of politics, where if you are on the side, if you're on the nationalist side, the anti-liberal nationalist side, and you're interested in questions of national identity, this is going to lead you, if you're a reader, this is going to lead you to a series of thinkers who were once either a bit marginal or forgotten, but who are now more and more read. And these are the guys who I thought we needed a guide to. And that's the key thing. Actually, to be honest, the origin of the Key Thinkers book is that the New York Times discovered that Steve Bannon, we still remember Steve Bannon, do we? Yeah.
He's got a podcast here. Yeah.
He's got a podcast,
Yeah.
right. Times discovered that Steve Bannon was referring to Evola and wanted to find out who on earth is this Evola. And it turned out that I was about the only person who could explain to them who Evola was. At which point Oxford University Press, when they read this in the New York Times, said, well, can we have a book on Evola? And I said, sorry, can't do that right now, but I could give you a collection on people like him. So that's the other origin of the book that you've just been reading.
Sure. And if you can give us some commentary, Afghanistan, the United States just pulled out of there, of course, and we have it's the Taliban is taking over. And you have said groups like Al-Qaeda often are accused of being religious terrorists, but they're actually political movements. Can you explain this theory, and what is your thought
Yeah,
on?
sure.
Okay.
This, by the way, is it's a different issue, different book, different period. But when I was in Cairo at night, there was so much discussion after 9/11 of something called religious terrorism. Now, I'm trained as a historian, and also I happen to be living in one of the largest cities in the Muslim world at this point. And it just didn't sound right to me, all this discussion about religious terrorism, because the objectives of the Al-Qaeda people, the objectives of the people who many Western observers were describing as religious terrorists, their objectives were, in my understanding, purely political. In Egypt, there was, in those days, it was Hosni Mubarak, and he was running an authoritarian regime which benefited some people if you were well connected, and a lot of people suffered in all sorts of ways. And the only serious opposition to this was the Muslim Brothers. Now, the Muslim Brothers said that they were trying to produce a just and God-fearing society, but in practice, they were trying to take over the state. Now, if you ask me, trying to take over a state is a political activity, not a religious one. And I think I'd say the same about the Taliban. They have, religion is there in their motivation. Religion is there in their legitimization. But they are essentially a political organization. They've just taken over a country, negotiated with the US in Doha before doing so, negotiated with the Chinese, sent people to Peking, and now they're forming a cabinet. Now, in my view, forming a cabinet and appointing ministers is essentially a political activity. So this is why, and of course the Taliban, are the Taliban terrorists, or are they a political party, or are they an administration? They've been all of these. Now they're putting the emphasis on being an administration. And from one of the things that I realized from my study of the history of terrorism is that the object of the exercise is to be able to make the transition from being a terrorist to being an insurgent, and from being an insurgent to being an administration. And if you can make that transition, you have achieved your objectives.
Yeah, I find it interesting in regards to terrorism when you study, say, what's going on in the various Muslim Islamic countries. We have groups like Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and essentially they're the same group when they come in and take over. They're the same group and the same leaders taking over the political positions. But in the West, when we go back to even Germany, Nazi Germany, we have these various different factions that are causing mayhem and terrorism. From Russia, we have the Bolsheviks. And then here today, we have who are called Antifa, that people say have a German type of origins. And these type of groups start causing chaos, and they're not actually the real group. They're like a front group that, like when Hitler came in, again, I don't know all the history, and I know you're not an expert on Germany and the Nazi history, but maybe you could relate with or share some information. What are this is the difference, would you say, in terrorism from the East and in Islamic countries, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, and then here we have front groups that seem like puppets that are put in place? Can you comment on that?
I think that what I'd say in very general terms here is that if you are a very small political group, you need to get people's attention. And this leads you to a whole range of activities that, that may involve stunts or setting up something that's going to look good on television and attract the journalists, or then in extreme cases, it involves killing people. Now, obviously, there is a very big and important difference between a media stunt and killing people, but the political logic behind them is comparable. Now, whether you are, whichever group you're in, you are probably looking for support of some sort. And everybody likes to be financed. I'm always very happy if somebody will pay for a bit of research leave for me. It's okay to want to be financed. But the people who are offering to finance me, we've got the Danish National Research Council and the European Union, both of which are relatively unproblematic organizations. If you've got a more radical political setup, the people who are going to be interested in financing you are often people who are less interested in supporting you than in making life difficult for the guys who are trying to run the state. And this has been going on since at least the First World War. If you look at the history of the First World War and who's supporting people on the other side and so forth, it's the logic there is very clear. The logic has not changed today.
And your studies, do you believe that history is cyclical, meaning that power changes from the left to the right, and possibly this change in Afghanistan, which we agree to, the United States, and as you had mentioned, China, that this is sanctioned and that maybe this is a symbolic event back to traditionalism with Afghanistan?
I'm not sure about whether history is cyclical, but I think that a lot of things can be understood in terms of the pendulum swing. We go from one extreme to another. This is part of human nature. It doesn't have to be big, grand political processes. In the university, first, the administration is giving us money to organize social events for the students, and then a couple of years later, the students' social events are getting out of hand, and now we search the pendulum swings. And I think this happens everywhere. In the case of Afghanistan, there's so many things going on there. With the history of Afghanistan is really complicated, and then there's the question of to what extent political Islam, like the Taliban, like Al Qaeda, like the Muslim Brothers, to what extent it is actually traditional, and to what extent it's modern. Because one way of understanding the Muslim Brothers, which is the model, the origin, the first big mass organization, is that Egypt in those days, it had a very active communist party and it had an active fascist party, and Said Qutb came along and decided to do an organization to compete with the communists and the fascists, but just with some different slogans. And if you see it that way, you then start thinking that these Islamist political organizations are actually not traditional at all. They're very modern, because the way you're organized politically tends to have implications for what you do. If you have, on the one hand, you have some ideas, and on the other hand, you have a large organization with membership structures and issues and internal politics, and then you have a political background to the whole thing, which in the case of the Muslim Brothers in Egypt was the British occupation and the nationalist reaction to the British occupation. And when you mix all this together, you are not going to get anything which is particularly traditional.
True. And we're living in the year 2021. And I know we were about an hour. If we could finish with one last question that I wanted to ask you in regards to your studies into Western esotericism. And you assert that it's distinctly Western. Our assertion that it's Western is no longer appropriate. Can you explain that briefly before we close?
Yeah, sure. There's this whole discussion especially amongst scholars who study Western esotericism, because it's a new and emerging field in academic studies, about to what extent it's Western and what do we mean by Western anyhow. And there is, on the one hand, I think, yes, we can refer to Western because there is a particular Western tradition of writing, of development of thought and of organization. And one of the ways that you can tell it's Western is by looking at the languages that are being used. And for many centuries, the relevant language was Latin. And Latin is not widely spoken or read outside the historical West. And today, if something is in English, English is no longer just the possession of the West. English is the international language. But if something is in German, German is not widely spoken outside the West. So in one sense, yes, you can talk about Western esotericism as a historical trend. On the other hand, how Western is this esotericism? And if you go back, you discover that a lot of these texts in Latin were translated to Latin from Arabic. And then if you go back to the Arabic texts, you discover that some of them were translated to Arabic from Greek. And at this point, who owns these ideas? And at this point, you can see that in certain cases, it's completely clear. You can say, here is this text which was written by Plotinus, and here is this text that was translated by Elkendi, and here is the Latin translation that was circulating in Paris in the 12th century. And you can trace the transmission of certain central and really important esoteric very clearly from one cultural sphere to another cultural sphere to yet another cultural sphere. And in that case, to try and say that these ideas are Western or Arab or Islamic or Greek or ancient or Hellenistic is ridiculous. The study of Western esotericism, I think, needs to recognize the ways in which esotericism is not Western, that esotericism is common to different cultures and civilizations and periods, as well as remembering, of course, yes, we do also have a tradition, an esoteric tradition, which is specific.
You just taught a lot of people how to think and to study philosophy correctly. So thank you very much. I agree 100% with you. And my research has took me back to the East and back to the Greeks. And if you not talk to them, but you read the writings of Homer and Plotinus and Plato, they talk about getting a lot of their teachings from Egypt, right?
Yeah. You then, if you're trained as a scholar, you have to start questioning this and saying, so where's the proof? And sometimes the proof isn't really there. Plotinus's teacher had studied in Persia and India, we are told. Okay, by one person. Do we have any corroborating evidence at all for this statement? Can we accept it at face value? No. Can we say this is a possibility? Yes. So,
correct. Yeah, and then you had the philosophers back then from Pythagoras. They were said to travel as well and teach in Italy and around the world. So that's a different podcast and a book in itself. And I know you have a couple more books coming out. One would be The Anarchist Artist Sufi, The Politics, Painting, and Esotericism of Ivan, how do you?
Agheli.
Agheli. Okay, you're very good at the various pronunciations. And the other book is An Esoteric Transfers of and Constructions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and Key Thinkers of the Radical. Okay, that was the other book that I mentioned. So
yeah, the Agheli book is in fact come out, but it's currently available only in hardback at a price intended to be paid by university libraries. So I don't recommend anybody who isn't a university library to buy it just yet. But it should come out in paperback and at a more reasonable price. And Agheli is the Swedish painter who moved to Paris, because you have to move to Paris if you're a painter in the 1890s, don't you? And then he gets sent to jail because he's caught in a roundup of anarchist terrorists, and frankly, the police weren't wrong, I think. And what does he do in jail? He reads the Quran. And then he goes to Egypt and he discovers about Sufism. He's a great linguist, this guy, learns Arabic, reads the Ibn Arabi, starts translating the Sufi classics into French, and is really important at the beginning of this traditionalist movement that I've been talking about, because somehow Guénon meets Agheli and that changes things very much for
Wow.
Getty. So I love that story. He's got some paintings. You can go and see them in if you go to a gallery in Sweden, you can see his paintings. There aren't any held outside, but I really enjoyed putting that book together, and I've been fascinated by Getty for many years.
Great. And this would be my first introduction to him. And you definitely have piqued my curiosity into reading this book and learning more about him. So yeah, thank you for sharing your knowledge with the Gnostic Warrior community. Where could we direct people that would like to find out more about your great work? Would that be your website, Amazon, where?
Yeah, there's a very dry university website, but you can see a range of my books on Amazon. And also for people who are interested in traditionalism specifically, I have a blog called The Traditionalists. If you Google Traditionalists blog, you get the blog where I have been posting updates for many years now, whenever I come to discover something new and interesting about the traditionalists, about Dugan, about people like that. I do a post on the blog. Not that often, but there's plenty of old posts that you can read your way through if you're interested.
I came across it last week and bookmarked it, so I highly recommend the listeners do that. So again, thank you for your time, Dr. Sedgwick, and I wish you the best in your great work.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.